how do we tap into that grounding? I mean, is that meditation? Is it praying? Is it journaling? What is grounding?
There are lots of ways, and all of those ways that you just mentioned are good ways to get grounded into that sense of something bigger. The soul is constantly sending us messages, and those messages come through dreams. They can come through being in nature and seeing what nature is doing out there. That indigenous peoples for thousands and thousands of years have looked to nature to help them understand where should the tribe migrate to, where is the good hunting going to be, what are the right days or times for certain rituals or celebrations. And they would look at the animals and sometimes the direction that they were flying.
What would you advise a leader that has experienced a moment of awakening and clarity that maybe they were the toxic ones, but are struggling to figure out how to integrate those insights into their... Hey there, welcome to the Peakality Podcast, your new favorite spot for unlocking the best version of yourself. Ready to level up your life? We've got you. We're all about blending technology with human wisdom and the drive to be better, personally and professionally. Each week, we dig into the real stuff, strategies, tools, and mindsets that cut through the noise and help you thrive. No fluff, just practical insights from experts, thought leaders, and people who've been there, done that. And we're here to break it all down into easy steps. Whether you're kicking off a fresh start or physicians seeking to inspire your patients, we've got stories, tips, and tricks to inspire growth in each area of life. Your peak potential is calling, starting right now. Hit subscribe, join our crew, and let's move forward today. Today, we are honored to welcome Dr. Bonnie Bright. Bonnie is a leading voice in consciousness, depth psychology, and soul-centered transformation. She founded the Institute for Soul-Centered Psychology and Coaching, where she integrates Jungian, archetypal, and transpersonal principles with ancient wisdom traditions to help individuals and leaders unlock clarity, purpose, and authentic power. Her somatic, symbolic, shamanic framework provides a unique path for transformation, resilience, and visionary leadership. Bonnie has trained extensively in dreamwork, holotropic breathwork, and indigenous African spiritual technologies, and the Enneagram, and her work has influenced thousands across the world. Join me in welcoming Bonnie to the show. So again, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm very excited to learn so much from you, as I have already. Just to dive right in, I mean, you work with leaders today about navigating complexity, uncertainty, and just constant change. What is it from your perspective is the biggest inner challenge that leaders are facing now that you feel?
Yeah, this is such a great question because, in fact, whether one considers themselves a leader or not, all of us are facing some pretty significant issues right now. If you just look around in the world today and see all of the strife and a lot of the polarization that seems to be existing in our world, it can be really disruptive and really challenging for us to be able to focus on the things that are actually the most important to us because it's so easy to get distracted. And so I would just say that really the absolute most important thing that any of us can do at this stage is to really make sure that we are both grounded in something that is bigger, let's say, than our everyday selves, which can get really distracted, but also for us to be able to act as a connection with ourselves or with what we might call our higher or our bigger selves. Neuroscientists these days tell us that we are only using a very small fraction of the pure potentiality of our brains. And if we start to believe that and understand that, then we need to start looking in those places where we can be more connected to something bigger that can give us the wisdom that we are seeking in order to be able to set good examples and to be able to move forward on the goals that we have in front of us. So I think that really coming back to that sense of connection with something bigger and deeper is going to be extremely valuable as we move forward in our world today.
Well said, obviously. I mean, and curious, when I keep hearing this, you had mentioned grounding. What is grounding? How do people ground themselves? I mean, what are some techniques or tools that you found effective for different people and different tools that are needed.
Yeah, I think what's really important maybe first is to have a little more discussion around that term grounding. Like, what does that even mean? It does get thrown around a lot, and it's a very good question when we start to look into that. And it comes back to what I was just saying about how there is so much strife and disruption in the world around us. And it may not be that there's more than there's ever been, but at the same time, we definitely have more access through media than we have ever had, any time in human history. And so we see the strife, we see the disruption, we see the discord that happens out there. And of course, it affects us because, we don't normally put in place those tools that we need to be able to really protect ourselves from some of that negativity that goes on around us. And so grounding for me is really a sense of being able to be connected with something that is bigger than us. And I think it's important maybe just to say briefly, make that distinction between what I call and what we call in psychology, the ego self versus what I like to call the soul self. Now, a lot of people get a little bit freaked out by that word soul because it has traditionally been related to religion. And a lot of people either don't appreciate religion or maybe they have some past experience growing up in it and have since wanted to move out of it and move into something that feels a little bit less limiting. For a lot of people, religion is actually very inspiring for them, and they need that, and they can ground themselves in religion. But the word soul is actually agnostic, in my opinion. And if you look back, the word soul is psyche in the Greek language. And of course, the word psychology then is actually saying that it is the study of soul. Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung after him, whose work I follow a lot, they were using the term psychology to describe this field of study that was burgeoning. What is it that makes humans tick? How do we behave? Why do we behave the way that we do? And it really is that we need to study this idea of soul and in order to understand how humans think. So just to make that a little bit more clear, I would say that we all have an ego self, and that ego self is kind of the sum of the parts of what we had to learn when we were very, very little in order to do two things. Number one, to feel safe in our human lives. And number two, to be seen and appreciated and accepted for who we were in our very young lives. Because if we had not been either safe or seen, we could fall into all kinds of, again, that discord that we were talking about, that dysfunction we were talking about. So our ego develops these coping mechanisms to be able to help us feel safe and help us feel seen. And that becomes the structure on which we base all of our future actions. Everything is about the ego, always assessing and trying to figure out, how can I feel the most safe in the situation? How can I feel the most seen and accepted in the situation? And then we go from there. We need to be able to step outside of that ego self and to really see when we are on this kind of autopilot that our ego self has determined for us to help us to survive and to take us forward. It's really a kind of programming that has made up our personality. But beyond that is the soul. And the soul is the idea of inspiration and intuition and what is it that can really bring meaning into our lives. And so I really like to look at what is it that can bring meaning into our lives. That's where we need to ground ourselves. We need to ground ourselves in this context of this amazing world that we live in and how we can actually feel that we can make meaning of the challenges that come our direction.
How do we tap into that grounding? Is that meditation? Is it praying? Is it journaling? What is grounding?
So again, such an important thing that we need to define. There are lots of ways, and all of those ways that you just mentioned are good ways to get grounded into that sense of something bigger. I would say even taking it further back, Carl Jung always used to say that images are the language of our soul. And so if it is important that we find a connection to our soul, if we want to call it that, you could also call it the universe. You could also call it God. Of course, there are lots of names for that larger force that is available to us in our lives. Any way that we can tap into that to get that sense of meaning is going to be important. And each of the ways that you just mentioned are good ways to do that. But because images are the language of the soul, one of the really core ways that you can actually tap into that grounding and that understanding of the messages that might be coming from your soul, which can see so much more than the ego self. The ego self has the blinders on, right? The soul is constantly sending us messages, and those messages come through dreams. They can come through being in nature and seeing what nature is doing out there. We know that indigenous peoples for thousands and thousands of years have looked to nature to help them understand where should the tribe migrate to, where is the good hunting going to be, what are the right days or times for certain rituals or celebrations. And they would look at the animals and sometimes the direction that they were flying or the time that the babies were born. All of these things could be signs and symbols. And so when we get grounded into nature, when we start to enter these psychologists might call non-ordinary states of consciousness, such as meditation, such as prayer, anything that takes us out of that ego self, again, that has those blinders on and that is just constantly scanning to try to help us survive. Anything that can take us out of that survival mode and into an expanded state of awareness where we can truly start to take in that we are contained in this beautiful natural world, that we have a place here, that there is meaning in our suffering, that there's meaning in our challenges, that when our employees or those that we are meant to lead are suffering, that we have the capacity to help them to provide context to that suffering and to get grounded into a felt sense of being with what we might call our soul. And when we do that through our imagination, we can start to find symbols, for example, in nature or from our dreams or from things that happen to us in everyday life. And then we can start to look into what do those symbols mean. We can start to engage with our imagination into these symbols. And then we can start getting information that we need to help us to be calm, to help us to be centered, and to help us be able to lead those that are around us that are also looking for some companionship or some help in their own struggles and journeys.
There's so many things we could dive in from all of this. And I never really thought about using the world around me as symbols of and how to interact with it as grounding, and to use my own imagination to do so. Can you explain how imagination really gets into how we are interacting with our soul? How does Carl Jung describe this, and who is he? I mean, I just introduced to him recently. It's fascinating, his teachings.
Yeah, so he was an early psychologist. He was born in 1875, to give you some context there, and he died in 1961. So he had a pretty long life during especially the early to mid 1900s, and he contributed an enormous amount to what we understand about psychology. I mentioned Sigmund Freud, and actually Jung was about 25 years younger than Freud was, and so he was kind of Freud's acolyte for a while. He came up in the world of Freud. He met Freud and they became very close and they worked together for several years. And then they had a bit of a falling out because a lot of us know Sigmund Freud or know of Sigmund Freud because he's kind of considered one of, if not the main ancestor, would say founding father of psychology. He fell out with Freud because Jung had some ideas that were, let's say, a little bit more esoteric maybe than Freud had. Freud was really fixated on his own interpretation of what psychology is, of what makes people tick. And what Jung landed on was this idea of what he called the collective unconscious. Is probably what he is most known for and his work is most known as. And the collective unconscious is basically everything that we don't know that we don't know. Now, that can get a little bit abstract if you start looking at it. But the field of depth psychology, which was to both of their work at the time, really is this study of the unconscious. And the reason that we would want to study the unconscious is because it has knowledge and wisdom that we do not have with our thinking mind, that our ego doesn't really have or understand unless we actually go looking for it. So, the question is, why would we want to go looking for it? Again, for two reasons, actually. One, because there is wisdom there, because that is maybe we can compare that to the vast part of our brain that we don't use because we don't know how to use it or how to tap into it. What is the value of the collective unconscious? Well, it's everything that has ever happened or ever could happen to humanity and our capacity to begin to understand that. And so that means like all of the mythology that we can ever see or hear or understand or study or learn about. Every single one of our indigenous ancestors all over the world have stories about their origins, have stories that would give them understandings and benchmarks to be able to live proper life, to live a good life, to take care of the world around them, to take care of each other and themselves. And so it's really important that we look back into the natural world. As I said, indigenous peoples also, dreams for them were very important to them. They understood that there is more than just the world that we see. There is, in fact, what we would call an invisible world, which is what Jung was positing too, this collective unconscious, in which all things exist. And if we can kind of just pluck out some of that information, we can use it as a metaphor to begin to understand what's going on in our own lives. So using Jung's work in depth psychology to begin to understand what is unconscious to us, whether it's on a personal level, things that we have repressed maybe throughout our lives, or things that we've just forgotten because they don't serve us, we don't think, to remember them. They don't serve the ego to remember them. A lot of things that were painful that the ego just wants to get rid of because it's too much for us to be able to think about, especially when we were kids. All of those things, we don't know about them until we actually start to look inward and to find some of these symbols that can represent parts of us that we may want to actually examine more closely, and we may want to actually work through, we may want to change. So one of Jung's big contributions is what we call the shadow. And the shadow is basically all of those things within our own personal unconscious that we have rejected about ourselves or forgotten about ourselves, things that maybe we felt would be judged so harshly when we were kids that we could not afford to hang on to them or remember them because it may have challenged the ego's ability to feel safe or to be seen and accepted because of who we were. A lot of things in our culture are not acceptable, or they're taboo, or we don't talk about things that happen to us. And so it's really hard for the ego to want to let all those things just be up at the surface and going on all the time. It'd distract us too much. Talk about being distracted, right? So it's really important that we work on ourselves. There was this whole idea of emotional intelligence that was going around a few decades ago. And that's a very important piece to all of this, because unless we know something about what has shaped us, and therefore what those things are that are still driving us in our everyday situations, every single minute of the day, begin to make change or transformation in our lives. That we make change or transformation is we have to be willing to be introspective, to look at our lives, to be looking for symbols and things that can serve as metaphor for our lives so that we can begin to understand what's happening for us. And I can give you just a real quick example of that before I let you get a word in edgewise again. There was a moment, I have a private practice and I work with people with symbols in this way, with dreams and symbols, and trying to understand what it is that is going on in their lives that they would like to shift and change. And so I was working with somebody not long ago, and we were going into this process of an expanded state of awareness, which is basically where you just close your eyes and turn your attention inward and allow yourself to just see what is coming up for you. Or maybe you'll remember a dream, or maybe you'll have a memory of something that you saw in nature that's just kind of sticking with you and you're very interested in it. And I asked her to come up with a symbol. And the way that we do that is you just, again, kind of let your mind soften and you see what is being given to you by whatever force you want to believe that it is. Again, imagination and intuition are a really good place to start if you haven't really thought about this before. And what came to her was these tomatoes that were on the ground that she said she had found outside her window. And she had planted tomatoes the year before in a garden. The year that we were talking, she had not planted any tomatoes. And yet all of a sudden she noticed that these tomato plants were growing again, probably from these tomatoes that had just fallen onto the ground the year before and were never picked up, and then were reseeding everything. And so when we started looking at that symbol of these tomatoes and tomato plants in her life and what was going on in her life, we realized that she was feeling very, very frustrated and stuck on some fronts in her work, that she just had done everything right, quote unquote, had done everything that she could do to try to make these projects move forward. She was very excited about them. She had passion about them, but they just weren't moving. And what we determined from those tomatoes and tomato seeds was that she has already done the work. She has already planted the seeds. Now is the time to just trust and wait and be patient and wait for the cycles, the natural cycles that are in play to bring back the rewards that she will be able to harvest in due time. But it was a huge breakthrough for her because she stopped putting all that pressure on herself, which we know pressure can lead to burnout, can lead to frustration, can lead to depression, can lead to a lot of very difficult negative emotions, that sense of being stuck. And she was able to stop judging herself for not succeeding in her project and just give herself some spaciousness. And it also allowed her to trust that there is something much bigger than her at work. It's not just her ego striving really hard to succeed and to reach goals and to be seen in a certain way. It is actually something that she is being taught and led to learn patience and to learn trust and to learn that when you put the hard work in, the learning is going to come back in some way, shape, or form. It's not always the way we think it's going to be, right? Sometimes it's different.
Yeah, yes. The patience, the waiting is not, especially in our culture. I mean, we're used to being in control and or at least thinking that we are. What a beautiful story and a great way for us to visualize like the sitting and waiting, just as though we plant the seeds, we have to give it time for it to actually grow. I love that. It's beautiful. Yeah. So you also talk a lot about archetypes and how it shapes behavior, leadership, identity. How can we understand what archetypes are and the patterns in which you talk about the shadow dynamics to help really understand this concept and how leaders can look at them so that they can avoid blind spots or elevate their impact?
Yeah, so archetypes are, until you do understand them, they can feel a little daunting. But actually, the truth is, you said the word already, and it's a really easy way for us to understand. And that is the word pattern. So an archetype is basically a word that Carl Jung came up with. Again, he gets the credit for that. It's attributed to him. But an archetype is basically a pattern. So it's a set of dynamics or criteria that actually make up something that we can look at and recognize it as a whole. Archetypes are words or concepts, we should say, patterns that we can recognize in every culture in the world and across all eras in the world. And they don't need explanation or definition because we already understand the concept almost as if we're understanding the whole thing as a package. For example, if I say the word to you, teacher, you already know what teacher means. You know what a teacher does. You know what usually the criteria surrounding a teacher might be. You know what the traits or characteristics of a teacher might be. You know what goal of a teacher might be. All of these things are already communicated to you directly because you have an understanding of that archetypal pattern of what a teacher is. Mother would be an archetype. Warrior would be an archetype. Healer would be an archetype. So you see, and, somebody asked once in a session that I was in, how many archetypes are there? Can we name them all? And Jung would have said that there are probably as many archetypes as we can even begin to imagine, because when we can understand something from that broader view as a pattern that communicates ideas to us, it is probably fair to say that it is an archetype or an archetypal pattern. And so for us as leaders, it's so important that we are able to do something that I like to look at as pattern recognition, because it informs us about what is going on in a given situation. If we can pull back and look at the whole and say, oh, wow, that employee that I'm working with over there really is carrying a victim archetype. What does that mean? Like, you can probably identify immediately, Courtney, already what that might mean for you if you were working with somebody that was carrying that victim archetype. So then you can ask yourself the question, how can I best help them or guide them or lead them into some kind of a solution if they're carrying that victim archetype? Maybe one thing that you could do is ask yourself, what is the opposite of the victim archetype? and see if you can bring ways or instances into that situation or into that person's life or working life where they could actually have resources that would be available to them that would bring the opposite of the victim into them. So I don't know, like, I don't want to put you on the spot. What's one idea that you think of that would be maybe the opposite of a victim if you were to think about it?
Leader, somebody,
Very excellent.
yeah. I mean, somebody
Excellent.
that is stepping in and not the victim, but someone that's empowered, which would be a leader.
Exactly.
So I think,
Exactly. Brilliant.
yeah. So I think that that's where, as we look at our shadow, because it's interesting that it seems as though we have multiple archetypes within ourselves, and it's really which one we are presenting in any given moment in a given situation, how we're showing up professionally, personally, and our love and relationships, and what is that dominant pattern that I think is what you're saying, and that how we address that and how we leverage our imagination to then move beyond. It seems as though you're saying the shadow self to empower ourselves to embody a different archetype. Am I understanding that correctly?
Excellent. Very, very well said. Exactly. So that's the idea. As leaders, when we can train ourselves to identify those patterns, then we can train ourselves to see what resources we can bring in. So you're absolutely right. If you have an employee or you're working with somebody, a colleague who is in that situation and they really are welcoming help, or it's your role or responsibility maybe to help them, then for you to be able to identify, okay, they need to be empowered so they are no longer a victim. So what projects can I give them, or how can I meet with them regularly so that they have the courage that they need to be able to make decisions or to move forward in a certain situation? You do see how all of us go through life with blinders on like this, and we see what we see and we know what we think we know, but there's so much more out here that we never even notice if we just go through with those blinders on. But when we start looking for those images, like a warrior, like a teacher, like a victim. And when we start to engage with those images in a more of an interactive kind of way, instead of just letting them run the show, like if you don't identify that somebody's in that victim archetype or carrying that victim archetype, you can't really help them unless you can find other ways to know what they need. And so if you can identify, okay, they need to be empowered, then it gives you almost this like a superpower to be able to really truly see something from a different perspective that nobody has been seeing before in order to solve or resolve a problem that is at work in their lives. So it's really important that we bring in that imagination and that we value imagination too, because often in the corporate world, and I worked in the corporate world for many, many years, we don't have that capacity to value sometimes the creativity and the imagination over the rational thought and the research and the scientific perspectives and the money making, the goals of the corporation and all of these things in our society, which you rightly pointed out earlier. Are not necessarily allowing us to use those resources of imagination and not really allowing us to embody the work that needs to be done so that we can get that felt sense. Really having a felt sense of something. And when I say that, what I mean is to experience something and to have a feeling that actually corroborates what's happening for us, validates what's happening for us, informs what's happening for us. But we cannot have those kinds of experiences unless we are allowing ourselves to feel, unless we are looking with that vision to be able to see what's going on out there. And then unless we're like tuning in to be able to almost download the information that we need to be able to bring in those solutions. And I will just say one really important part of that is to then, once we have those images or archetypes that are at play, once we have an understanding of those, we can start to engage with those. And there's many ways to do that. One of them we have already talked about, which is identifying what is the opposite that needs to happen here, that needs to come in so we can bring in some kind of a balance. But another way we can do it, which Jung really advocated, is to actually enter into literally a dialogue with those images. So if you identify in yourself, for example, that you are carrying that victim archetype and you just find yourself always asking, why does this always happen to me? It never fails. This is always something that I've struggled with. I'm always going to struggle with this. When we can identify that, we can, again, drop into that place of introspection, of self-reflection, a quiet place where you're not going to get interrupted, and you can tune in to that bigger force that animates all of us, whether you want to call it your brain. I like to call it consciousness, actually, because, that's something that we are understanding more and more does not come from the brain itself. In fact, we might be tuning into that, like with little antennas in our brain. Quantum physics, is telling us this now, that we might be just tuning into a field of information, which is like Jung's collective unconscious. And so if we are constantly looking for that opportunity and then starting to dialogue, like asking that victim archetype, see if you can imagine it personified. What would that look like? Would it look like a little old man? Would it look like a scary witch? What would that look like? Would it look like somebody just lying on the ground, with the cars running over them? I mean, I can think of all kinds of images that might come up for somebody in a situation like that. And then you ask that image, what are you for? Why are you here? What is your purpose? What do you need from me? And it might sound really kind of odd or unusual if you're not used to doing this kind of work. But what we are getting at is we are trying to bring in these metaphors from the unconscious that we don't normally have access to at all. If we can bring them into our consciousness and then start to interact with them, it makes, instead of being just driving us and unconsciously so, we can actually separate this into two. And then I can see that archetype. I can understand more about it. I can dialogue with it. And then something can change. My relationship with that victim archetype can change if I'm bringing it into consciousness and trying to figure out what it needs from me. So Jung gave them a lot of autonomous action on their own. Like he knows that, we can almost become possessed by some of these archetypes, or by what he called complexes, which is basically an archetype that is running the show for us, and we don't even often realize it.
So, and when we don't realize it, how do we identify it? Like if we don't recognize, so many people that we talk to, whether they're leaders, they're athletes, they're peak performers that are trying to overcome obstacles, and they find themselves in addiction or a victim mindset or both, it's often hard to recognize what that shadow, what that archetype is representing. So, I mean, what would you advise someone to do to try and at least recognize that archetype that is in your shadow self that you need to flip the narrative with?
This is such an important piece of all of this work, isn't it? Like most of us don't realize it on our own because we are carrying it and we think we're all alone and we can't see it. It's like when you get up in the morning and you get dressed, then how often do you actually stop in front of a full-length mirror and look at yourself and what you're wearing again? You never really stop and look again once you've put your clothes on, right? But everybody else can see it. So here's the first clue. When we are identified with an idea or a complex, as Jung called it, again, this is just a challenge that came up for us that we took on these coping mechanisms to be able to identify with. When we are identified with it, we don't see it for ourselves. It's just running the show, and we don't understand that it is a set of patterns or a pattern that is running the show for us. A couple of things come to mind when you ask that question. One is we really need to slow down and give ourselves some spaciousness for that aforementioned self-reflection to be able to happen. I think we can safely assume that every single one of us has not just one archetype that is consuming us, but you alluded to that earlier. We are carrying multiple archetypes all of the time. Of course we are. We're never going to just be living out one. But often there is one that is dominant in our lives overall, depending on how we learned how to be able to cope with stuff that was hard when we were kids, all the programming that we got. And we also have to be able to take some time for ourselves. So in the corporate world, I know from experience, it's just so fast moving all the time. And it seems to be getting worse these days with AI and the advent of all these new tools and technologies that are just hitting us, nonstop now. It's going to get worse and worse. It makes it much more important that we find the opportunity to take that space and to slow down. Jung always liked to tell the story, which I find so profound in our current culture. He went to visit Africa. He was Swiss and he lived in Switzerland, but he visited some of these far off countries and cultures when he was in his 40s and 50s. And so, in the mid kind of 1900s, when airplane travel was not as common as it is today, he really made huge efforts to go to Africa and to India and to some other far-flung places from Europe. But he went to Africa and he tells the story of traveling around with some people who were driving a car. And this was I think it was in the teens or early 20s, maybe 1920s. And there were not that many cars in Africa at all. In fact, even now, some countries, there are not that many cars in Africa. And so this was a huge new thing that a lot of villagers had never seen before. And so Jung and the people with him were visiting a village and they were showing the car. And it turned out that one of the men from the village needed to go to the next village, which was several miles away. And so they invited this villager, do you want to come in the car with us to go to the next village so you don't have to walk? And so the man agreed to it and he got in the car and they started driving away. And all of a sudden the villager just started yelling, stop the car, stop the car. And so they stopped the car and they weren't sure what was happening. And the villager jumped out of the car and laid down on the ground and just laid there. And so it turns out that when they really asked him what's happening right now, he said, I felt that when the car started moving, it was going so fast that my soul could not keep up with me. And so I had to get out of the car and stay on the ground until my soul could catch up with me. So that gives you an idea of how critical that connection to soul was for them. Like they really understood we need something that can give us meaning in our lives. When we go through hard stuff, if we can understand that the reason we're going through hard stuff is because we are here to learn and to grow and to transform and maybe to help other people in the long run, right? If we can get ourselves in alignment with something bigger, with an alignment with what makes us happy and what makes us feel joy and compassion and empathy and love for other people, to be able to lead other people with these same kinds of techniques and criteria, then we can actually make a difference in our lives. We are in touch with one another and especially with ourselves and that bigger part of ourselves. So it's really important that we slow down and that we allow ourselves to have that space. And then the second thing I will just say, because I think it's really important, is Jung always said we can't do this work by ourselves. Now, I think there's a certain amount you can, but we cannot see those clothes that we put on first thing in the morning, right? And so that's why it's so important to work with somebody that you trust, whether it's a psychologist, a coach, or just a close friend or a colleague, somebody that can see you and that you are open to listening to when they see things about you that you can not see for yourself so that you can make the changes that you really need to make.
That's one theme that I keep hearing in the back of my head is the importance of the people that you're surrounding yourself with, and then the trust in those people that you're surrounding yourself with, and then being willing to change with the people that you're surrounding yourself with. It seems as though that if you find yourself in an old pattern and you find yourself, surrounded by people that aren't embodying this, archetype that you want to embody, or it's prohibiting you potentially from moving forward, you've got to be able to recognize that and then be willing to address it, being willing head on. And that's hard for a lot of people, whether it's, professionally or in their love in their relationships, just overall family dynamics. That is one thing that I think that a lot of us are afraid to face, the archetype of the shadow, as you are referring to it, because of how that's going to disrupt their life and how that's going to disrupt their relationships personally and professionally. I mean, what would you advise someone that is recognizing this, that feels it, is uncertain as to how to even make those changes?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really important that we talk about this because I think every one of us has probably been stuck in this situation at one point or another. And it's really hard when it's in our career because that's where we go to make a living. That's where we go to manifest our personalities and our gifts in the world. That's where we go to help other people in whatever way it is that we are fulfilling that role. But I would say, first of all, I've seen a lot of people in my own personal practice that as they put their foot on this path and they begin to open up to the knowing that there's so much more here, but that we are really here in this life to grow and to learn. And that if we can start to take those challenges and really look at them as opportunities, not that things are happening to us, but actually that things are happening for us. Maybe that soul self has a blueprint for us that actually is going to lead us to our highest capacity to be who we really are, this unfettered, joyful being that can actually make a difference in other people's lives, that can actually enjoy our own lives and find fulfillment in our lives. And so we have this capacity to discern when we are surrounded by people that are just toxic for us. And when I say that, I mean, everybody's going to have challenges and everybody's going to have coping mechanisms that are a function or a product of, again, our programming when we were really little. If you grew up in a household where violence was kind of the norm, you may have a much higher tolerance for violence than you would have otherwise. And you may move into a relationship at a later time in your life when actually there's some violence in the relationship. When we grow up in a certain way, again, that tolerance just allows us to stay in those kinds of situations. But I have seen so many people in my own private practice that as they start to understand that there is so much more here than what we see, than the clothes that we just put on in the morning, that we have the capacity to see ourselves in different situations. A lot of times those old friendships start to fall away, or those people that we have been with our whole lives begin to get more distant from us. And we really, if we look at it from one perspective, we really owe it to ourselves to make sure we remove ourselves from those kinds of toxic people or toxic situations. It's not that those people are evil or bad. It's that we get to make that choice to work on ourselves. So if we have things that we do, habits, patterns, practices, things that really are not serving us or serving the people around us, we have the capacity to decide we want to change that. And we can start doing this work, and it can help us to change those patterns, to identify the shadow when it's at work, to identify our tolerance to be used maybe, or taken advantage of sometimes. That can be something that comes up for us. We have to be able to remove ourselves from those situations. Now, if it's a workplace, it's a lot harder because, again, we depend on that for certain things. But sometimes there are hard decisions that have to be made. Or sometimes we have to go to a leader that we rely on, a mentor that we rely on, and say, how can I get myself out of this situation because it's really not serving me? And to maybe come up with some other ideas and brainstorm with somebody else on how you can remove yourself. But most importantly, I would say we have to be the ones that take that initiative to identify when there's something that makes us feel bad or icky. You know how you can just come away from a situation and feel that? We have to tap into our own sovereignty. We are the only ones that know what we need and want. We are the only ones that know how we can feel really bad when we are in certain situations that just aren't serving us. And so we are the only ones that can choose to take a different route to get ourselves out of that, or to bring something into that situation to get us more balance. Again, one of those things might be us taking the time. I don't want to use the word meditate because that's not always easy for everybody, but to take time with our soul to just enjoy and appreciate what it feels like to be in a state of ease and flow. So whether that's just taking a 5-minute walk in nature in the middle of the day because you just need to get out and clear your head, or whether that's listening to evocative music and just allowing yourself to really be emotionally free to flow with that music, or whether it's writing, as you mentioned earlier, journaling can be a really powerful practice for some people. Whatever it is that just makes you feel good, this is something that we have to tap into in order to let those other patterns come in. It creates portals for us in our lives where something new can come in and inform us and help us to change the track that we are on, that we are not appreciating in those moments.
Yeah, this is beautiful. I mean, and what would you advise a leader that has experienced a moment of awakening and clarity that maybe they were the toxic ones, but are struggling to figure out how to integrate those insights into their daily role? I mean, if you're so used to being a certain role and you've got that pattern in your brain of this is how I would react, how do you learn how to embody that new way of being? How do you allow to forgive yourself as well as others to forgive you? I mean, how do you really step into that new role of being if you find yourself in that more toxic role?
Yeah, well, we all have it, right? That's the shadow again at work. And first of all, you have to really want to change. So if you are ready, I often find that some of these traits, some of these situations come up for us that actually reveal certain things, reflect certain things back to us about ourselves. They come up for a reason. If you go through an experience where it's just really unpleasant, like you're engaging with somebody and maybe it erupts into an argument or something, it's very unpleasant. You have to be willing to look at yourself and go, what was it that triggered me? And what is a trigger? A trigger is something that creates a response, or a reaction is even a better word for it, that we didn't intend. It's just automatic. But we get triggered because of the stuff that happened to us when we were little kids and us trying to figure out, like, what does that mean to me? When you're 4 years old, if you get yelled at by a parent, for example, that makes a 4-year-old feel very, very, very unsafe, because any of us, even though we're only 4 years old and we don't have full access to our brain, we know that we can actually lose the support of our parents. We wouldn't have a roof over our heads. We wouldn't have food on the table. And so it becomes a very existential challenge if we get yelled at by a parent. So we might change our behavior in order to make sure that we feel like we can be loved or that we are lovable. And sometimes those patterns that we pick up are not always good for us, but they are the only thing that allows us to be able to function in that certain situation as a 4-year-old and to be able to move forward. We don't think about how we're responding, but it becomes the foundation of a pattern for the rest of our lives that we might actually pick up and just run with. So when we come to some understanding, or when we suddenly get a glimpse of a way that we maybe have dealt with things for all of our lives that isn't really ideal, that other people are seeing as a negative, that can be very challenging, first thing we have to do is then forgive ourselves. And you alluded to this and you said, how do we forgive ourselves? Well, one way is to really begin to understand that as that little child in the face of whatever it was that we were facing, we did not have a choice. We didn't have the capacity to say, oh, I don't want to react abruptly. I want to just go over here and go, oh, I'm fine, right? We just reply or respond in whatever way we can in order to survive. We have to forgive ourselves, because us, and this goes back to our parents too, everybody is only doing the best that they can do. Every single one of us has experienced some kind of trauma, whether it's a little trauma or a big trauma. Some people, really understand that they've had some very overt, acute trauma. And some people don't understand that they've had developmental trauma, which is just, again, could be mom or dad yelling at you and you going, oh my gosh, I don't know what to do now. I'm going to have to make this better, and changing our behavior because of that. And so we really need to be able to forgive ourselves, to understand that at that time that we developed this response or reaction, we didn't know what we were doing. And that gives us the capacity to really look back at our lives and going, all of those years, all of those decades, I was acting this way, but I didn't know better, because if I had known better, of course I would have done better. Of course. So we have to give ourselves that affirmation too, that we are doing the best that we can, always. When you catch yourself with that shadow, instead of jumping to more criticism of yourself or more self-hatred or self-loathing or lack of understanding, to say, wow, I was doing the best that I could, and now I see it, and now I want to change it. And then from there, we can absolutely change it. And we can do that by calling again on our dreams, by symbols, by looking in nature, by creating metaphors and looking at how we are being informed all the time by that bigger something.
What are some emerging practices you believe will help shape the future of conscious leadership?
Interesting that you say that, because I would say probably a lot of people would answer that question with meditation. And it's not that it's exactly emerging in the world, because meditation has been around for thousands, if not tens of thousands of years. We can understand it in various different ways. There's a lot of different kinds of meditation. But one of the most important ones is this clearing of the rational brain, that monkey mind that is just always making comments, is always chattering, is always making judgments, even value judgments. We have to be able to really really look at the areas in our life where we are making value judgments and saying, this experience is good and this experience is bad. Imagine we all have stories, but the story doesn't have any meaning until we place some kind of value judgment on it to say, this is a bad thing that happened in my life, and this is why I am the way that I am as a result of it. What if we could look back at those stories and just give them some space and say, this is what I was experiencing or feeling, but it doesn't have to mean that this story is complete the way that it is. So I've been working for a while now on a new practice that I'm calling storyinting. And it's this idea of how do we navigate by looking at the stories that have shaped our lives, and how do we change the meaning that we have anchored to those stories in order to be able to take a step back and say, why did this story actually show up in my life? And what does it actually mean, instead of what I have always assumed it meant, which has defined me for decades, if not my entire life. So I think that recognition is important.
Yeah.
And, meditation, even the term meditation and the terms consciousness in the last decade have just skyrocketed. So I really feel like as a humanity, we are also coming into new awareness, because we have to. We cannot continue to live this extremely polarized, society, and with the violence and the hatred that are just more easily erupting every single day, and social media and the dangers and harms that can have on us. I mean, again, there's no good or bad, but it's about us beginning to ascertain what are the situations that are not serving us, that are bringing us down, that are attributing to these stories that are not helping us. And how can we start to open up into more compassion, more empathy, more of the capacity to be open to what is coming down the pipeline, and to be able to hold that without jumping to conclusions. And this helps all of us to be leaders, in the sense that if we can just do what we call hold space for what's happening in the world, to see it, to be a witness to what's going on, even if we can't jump in and donate millions of dollars, or, be in the streets at the time, or go fight in the war that's happening somewhere, we can still witness it and understand that people are suffering, and understand that there are all of these archetypes at work. Maybe we cannot change at the outer level, but if we can align ourselves, we can actually make that change. And I'll just leave you here with one more story from Jung. He always talked about this story of what he called the rainmaker. And this story was something that he suggested should be told every single time people gathered together for any reason, because he felt it was so important. And this is a story that came from China, from a very good friend of his who lived in China for many decades. And his friend brought this story back from China and told Jung. And the idea is there was a village that was suffering from extreme drought, and they had been suffering for several years, and they had not had any rain or any snow, any moisture at all. And they were really getting desperate. They didn't have enough food for the animals. And so really the whole village, was just starting to disintegrate, and they did not think they were going to survive. And they heard of this man that was called a rainmaker, who could make it rain. They went and searched far and wide and brought this guy into the village. And when he got in the village, he just said, I don't need anything, but I just need a little hut where I can be. I need somebody to bring me meals, and then I'll let you know. So they gave him this little hut, and they started bringing him meals. He was in there for 3 days. And then at the end of 3 days, it started to snow. And people were just, it was a miracle, like shocked. And this is, a true story, or presumably told as a true story. And when he came out, they asked him, what did you do? How on earth did you actually, it's a miracle. How did you make it rain? And he said, when I entered the village, I could feel how out of balance everything was. And he said, I could feel the Tao was out of balance, how this massive organizing principle was completely out of balance. And he said, then I could feel that I was out of balance. And so he said, I went in that hut and I sat there until I could bring myself back into a sense of balance and wholeness. And then it rained, because then my world, my experience also came back into a sense of balance. And we were lacking moisture, and so the moisture showed up and came. So it's really, I think, such a critical story to be able to understand that we have that power. We have the capacity to bring ourselves back into balance, to do our own work on ourselves, if you want to look at it from that perspective. Why would we do that? Because it's going to make us a better person. It's going to make us a better leader, but it's also going to make our lives more easy, because we can understand when we come up against an obstacle, instead of bumping against it and resisting it and being frustrated and fighting it, we we can come up against it and go, okay, what is there here for me? I'm going to surrender to what is here. I'm going to look for what it is I'm supposed to be learning from this. And it's going to allow me to just flow around that like water would flow around a rock instead of bumping up against it all the time. And then we can understand there is always going to be something here for us to learn from any obstacle that we come up against. And if we can look at it from that perspective, then we don't get all frustrated and down on ourselves, but we can say, what is it here for me to learn? And then we can learn it and we can move on with our lives instead of having to get that same lesson over and over and over and over again until we actually see it in our face. So the more that we are open and willing to surrender and to learn, the easier it's going to be for us to be those leaders and then also to be pillars in this day and age when so many things are really looking seriously wrong out there and there's so much dysfunction. We need to be able to hold that space for the world, for others, for those who are suffering, those who can't see it yet, to understand that what is happening out there is also happening in here. And if we can get this right, then this will start to fall into place as well.
Oh my gosh, Bonnie, I love talking to you, and I love all the insights that you bring. And I want to have you again because I have still so many questions, but I know we're tight on time. How can people get a hold of you?
So you can go to my website. I run the Institute for Soul-Centered Psychology and Coaching. So if you just type in instituteforsoulcentered.com, you'll find it there. I run programs to teach people to be a coach, to do this kind of work, to help people work with their dreams, to work with symbols, to find those metaphors that are running their lives. And that's for me is really, really such fulfilling and important work. And just watching people be able to come into their own understanding of their stories and the gifts and the resources that they have available to them is really, really powerful. You can also find me on most social media at Bonnie Bright, PhD.
Amazing. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Bonnie. I sincerely appreciate it and look forward to continuing the conversation.
Likewise. Thank you so much, Courtney.
Yeah. You're amazing. I was like trying to get on tight of the time because I knew you have at 5:00, but thank you. I know we ran over a little bit, but this is beautiful. I'm going to record that bio. I'll share with you as soon as possible, but oh my gosh, I totally went off script, but I loved it all.
I love it though. It felt really genuine and your questions are amazing, Courtney. So you're a really great interviewer.
Okay.
It's been really fun. I'd love to do it again.
Good. Yes. I would love to do it again. Love it. Love it. Love it. Awesome. All right. I'll be in touch soon. Thank you again.
Okay.
All right.
Lots of love. See you soon.
All right. Bye.